Good morning, everybody. Can you guys hear me?
Yes. All right.
All right. We got the sound okay, everybody? All right, so welcome to the future of television. My name's Jerry Murdock, and I am the moderator of this session. I'm going to let the panelists introduce each other, but if you guys enjoy this session, let me recommend a session at 4:15 called The Human Interface. It is the revolutionaries of technology design. They'll be talking about how they're trying to change your world in a big way. So if this resonates, 4:15, it'll be right back here at Pepke. It'll be fantastic for those people who like it. So I'll let the panelists introduce themselves first. For the far side, Julius.
And do you want us to say a couple of minutes on the topic or save it?
Yeah, just give us a minute of, yeah, go ahead.
All right, so I'm Julius Genachowski. I spent the last 4 years as the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission and 10 years before that in the internet and media industry in the private sector. The FCC is responsible for the infrastructure, the platform over which all this stuff is happening. Wired and wireless internet, broadcast television, cable, et cetera. And there are probably some policy things we can come back to and talk later. I thought what I might do at the top is say a couple of things about what I'm long on and what I'm short on in this general area. And let me do that by making this point. When it comes to the future of TV, sometimes people lump lots of things together. And I think when we talk about the future of TV, we're talking about the future of devices, the TV device. We're talking about the future of distribution. We're talking about the future of advertising. We're talking about the future of content. So very briefly in Twitter-like format, I would say on devices, I'm short one platform and long multiple platforms. I'm long set-top boxes of various sorts, smaller, more intelligent ones that are coming. On distribution, I'm short over-the-air broadcasting and long mobile and internet. On advertising, I'm short traditional forms of advertising and long social. And on content, let's see, I'm short linear, long non-linear. I'm long appointment viewing, like sports and even the premiere of over-the-top event programming like Game of Thrones or Arrested Development on Netflix. And I'm very long all sorts of new kinds of lengths of programming in this new world. Twitter's doing 6-second loops, which are really exciting. But I'm very long also short, medium, and long-form storytelling. I think the one thing that doesn't change when it comes to video is the interest and hunger and passion that people have for storytelling, and I'm long that.
Okay. Michael?
Hi, I'm Michael Lynton. I'm Chief Executive of Sony Entertainment. I'm responsible for Sony's film and music and television business. So on the specifics of the television business, to give you a little bit of a history of where the studio is, 12 or 13 years ago, I've been there now about 10 years ago, we decided to get out of the television business pretty much. We blew it up because after the SIN-FIN rules changed, the economics became unacceptable to an independent studio. Since that time, we've built the business up, and we can talk about that more. It has turned into probably the most profitable business for us. And what we've all seen, everybody I think, is this renaissance of television, not just in terms of the quality of the television, but also in terms of the quantity of it. We in the studio, in the US market, have about 35 shows on the air in various different versions of what I would call the air, whether that's cable or broadcast or Netflix. And we've also got a very large business outside the United States producing television shows in places like India and UK, Colombia. So for us, television has grown exponentially as a business over the last decade.
You guys, you're in your television, you're in about 800 million homes, correct? Shows like Days of Our Lives, shows like
Breaking Bad and Yeah, all sorts of shows.
Shark
it runs
Tank?
the gamut.
Yeah,
Shark
Shark
Tank,
Tank.
Jeopardy, runs the gamut.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
But 800 million homes, that's pretty global business.
Well, I think we do two things. So our television shows are actually probably in more than that. We also run a bunch of television networks. So, and most of those networks are outside the United States.
Right.
There's a big one, for example, in India, and those are in 800 million homes.
Great, great. Dick?
I'm Dick Costolo. I'm the CEO at Twitter. Before that, I wandered the earth. I think when I think about Twitter and TV, we like to think of Twitter as a force multiplier for media. What I mean by that is, actually, you can think of it in the terms of Newton's second law. Where the force equals the mass of the piece of media and times acceleration. And I really think of, if you think of Game of Thrones is on at 8 p.m. and you've got this piece of media there, that Twitter acts as an accelerant on that. And the conversation around it really is a force multiplier to media. In fact, we even see the conversation on Twitter about a program extend hours after the program has ended. There will be sort of an increase in conversation about it while the program is on air. And then for hours after the program has gone off, there's this continuing conversation about it that really helps sort of pull other people into the conversation, pull other people into the program, and extend the relationship between the show and the people watching it. So we talk about that at length.
Right. Well, before you were wandering the earth, you were a stand-up comedian, right?
Well, it was mostly improv. I didn't really do much. It's a funny thing, actually. Improvisers and stand-up comedians sort of have this antagonistic relationship that you would think you wouldn't notice if you were outside the industry.
Yeah, but I mean, the CEO job of Twitter is probably one of those enviable jobs in the world. He's running over 3,000 revolutionaries working for him directly, trying to change the world. But you ran into one of your old colleagues recently, right? Steve Carell?
Yeah, I used to perform with Steve at Second City like 25 years ago.
And what did he say to you when he saw you?
Yeah, so I saw him at a fundraiser for the Lucille Packard Children's Hospital in Palo Alto, and we were talking. I had an old review, a Chicago Sun-Times review of one of our shows at Second City, and he patted me on the back and said, "I'm sorry it didn't work out for you." So he's a great guy. His success couldn't have happened to a nicer guy.
So what are your revolutionaries that you're running now? What are they thinking about in terms of television? And what are the new kind of products you guys are thinking about?
Well, so one of the things we're doing is, as I mentioned, there's sort of the conversation about what's happening. If you think of the conversation on Twitter about what's on air right now, one of the other things we're starting to see is Julius mentioned appointment TV, like sports events. We're starting to see those kinds of broadcasters use live clips, so something that happened literally seconds ago in a game, to tweet out those very short clips as the sort of canvas attached to a 140-character tweet about something that just happened in the game, and using that to draw people in. So we've created this Amplify product that allows folks like ESPN to tweet out here's LeBron, blocking this dunk that this guy just tried to make. It literally happened seconds ago, and people will see that in their Twitter streams, and it's driving tune in. And then you can use that to, there are actually, when you talk about new forms of advertising, we've actually just got these little 2-second pre-rolls in those clips. And you might think, well, what can you do in 2 seconds? But it's a great way for brands who are advertising on the show or on the basketball game to surround that online, and it works quite well.
Great. So, Michael, what is Twitter doing for you guys at Sony?
Well, it does a lot in terms of, first of all, for the television shows that still are not that are still on the air, that are not being watched, as people call it, binge watching, but we have this long space of a week in between. One way to look at it is sort of tantric viewing. You actually have to wait. You have to wait for the next episode to show up. It can't all show up at once. There's that prolonged
There'll be a panel at 2 o'clock.
There's the panel at 2 o'clock with some yoga instructors. But in the tantric viewing world, Twitter is very, very important, because what happens obviously there is a show. Breaking Bad is a good example. The show is aired, and then for the next 6 days, people have tremendous conversations around, as Dick was suggesting, what's been said, what's going on, what do they think the next show is going to be about. Obviously, that plays a lot into the marketing of the show as well. So, and we work closely with Twitter because you, in some way, want to, although we have limited success there because it's obviously a free panel, a free forum, you want to help the conversation move along.
Right. I read that over the last decade, the amount of people that are TiVoing or using DVRs on television has doubled.
Yep.
Is Twitter bringing back the live experience? Is this good for advertisers? Is it good that people want to have a connection to the live conversation on Twitter as well as watching the show?
Yeah, I think to some extent. I mean, certainly, obviously, for things like sport and things like that. But I think those, regardless, we're going to have a live experience. But I think, in general, people, to your point, what we used to call the water cooler effect has been vastly exaggerated by Twitter. And as a result, people want to be in the know when it happens. So if one of these shows that is got a big following suddenly happens on one particular night, you don't want to be out of the mix on Twitter, and so you tend to watch it by appointment viewing, which would help advertising.
Yeah. You guys are also doing a talk show in China. Is that right?
Yep.
Is that right?
We've done them in the past. Yeah.
Is that kind of different for you guys, doing something like that?
No, we do talk shows and all over the world, frankly. I mean, if you can imagine, we've taken a show like Dr. Oz, and we've even put it in a place like Turkey. It's actually about to happen in China. So no, we've done them everywhere.
That's great. So Julius, when you were in your previous job at the FCC, how did you think about connected TV devices and stuff, which are these TVs that most of us think of TV as just a box where you hook it up to a cable and there's our TV, but connected TVs are these devices that are connected to the internet. Last year, 2012, they sold about 200 million of these connected TVs around the world, and they expect to have 600 million connected TVs by 2017. And if they hit that number, that'll be about 22% of all television sets will be connected to the internet, where they can watch streaming as well as broadcast. How do you think about that, and what was the policies you were?
It's a great question, because the incredibly cool things that Michael and Dick and others are doing all depend on an infrastructure there that will allow for high-speed, high-capacity transmission in both wired and wireless. Video obviously is much more demanding than non-video. And we're in a pretty good place right now as a country, right? We've gone on mobile from being behind the rest of the world to leading the rest of the world with 4G, LTE, and the incredible devices and apps that we have in the United States now. On the wired side, lots of progress. We've doubled speeds in the US in the last 4 years, gone from 20th worldwide to 8th in terms of our speeds, and the trajectories are good. This is all really important, and I think not everyone has to continue to pay attention to this, but I'll tell you that if we don't as a country keep paying attention to this, then we'll freeze up the innovators who are planning ahead for faster and faster speeds and planning for things like interconnected TVs everywhere. So yeah, it's coming. Every TV will be connected to the internet. That and the intelligence, whether it's in boxes or in TVs, will change the experience dramatically. There's three things that we need to focus on from a policy perspective to make sure this happens. One is the continued focus on speed and capacity, wired and wireless. The second is competition at all the different levels, being concerned about gatekeepers or insufficient competition. And the third is the openness of the internet. An internet-connected TV has less value if it's a closed platform and anyone with an idea, video or otherwise, can't get access to it.
Got it. Michael, how do you think about competition in this world that's changing? You run these television networks around the world. Are these television networks at risk at all or under threat by the internet, or how do you view it?
Well, we sort of sit on both sides of the equation. So on the one side of the equation, we run these television networks, which in many of the markets, India is a good example, the internet, high-speed internet, has not shown up to the point where we really do have competition. That's more in a place like Western Europe or obviously the United States. But where there is, you obviously have to be, you're constantly debating this. Do we just want to be a conventional network, or do we actually want to do something on the internet as well with the network? The other side to it, though, is that all of a sudden we have all of these buyers for our product that we didn't have in the past. Right. So let's take the UK as a really good example. The UK, up until about 3 years ago, really there was just Sky if you wanted to sell your movies into that market. And every 3 years you'd show up at Sky and they would knock you back. And they'd say, we're the only buyer, so it's us or nobody. Now that Netflix is in the market and Amazon is in the market with Love Film, you all of a sudden actually have a competitive marketplace for your product again. And as a result, it's a very good time to be a seller of movies and television shows, for that matter, all over the world, because you have these new networks coming on as a result of this high-speed internet that's being discussed.
You know, Dick, does Twitter help these shows measure engagement? I mean, around the world, as he's now got product that he's got to think about the global audience, can you help him by saying, hey, look what's happening in your country with Twitter conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a little bit distracted by how comfortable Julius's shoes look, so I'll try to remember the question. So
there's a panel at 3 o'clock.
They're really it's remarkable.
Well, this is Aspen.
So you know, you leave your job at the FCC and it's you know, it's pajamas and slippers for the rest of the year. There are a couple interesting things I would say. One of the interesting things is that with some of these over-the-top programs like House of Cards, when I talked about Twitter being a force multiplier, I think that it's fascinating to note that since there wasn't a moment where it premiered, you know, like a Game of Thrones, that the first run is on at 8 p.m. Sunday night, et cetera, there's no point in time that everyone sort of gathers together to converse about it. So you don't get that. Of course, it was an incredible success, but there wasn't a lot of conversation about it because, you know, you watch it, and then your attention in the time after you watch it, you might say something about it, but if no one else is watching it at that time, there's no sort of, you know, the conversation doesn't bubble up. So I think it would be interesting for, you know, Reed and the folks working on things like those sorts of programs, House of Cards, to at least have a sort of a, you know, like the Arrested Development. Here at this point in time, we're going to release it, and there's a moment that they can all start to talk about it and drive conversation. For those programs that do have a point in time that they're on, like a Game of Thrones or a Pretty Little Liars, et cetera, or a sporting event, we absolutely help those guys measure engagement. In fact, we just announced a relationship with Nielsen, where Nielsen will now take the data from Twitter and use their methodology to create a Twitter TV rating, so that it will create this sort of, we've known for a while what the share was for the show, what the viewers looked like for the show. Now we'll see a sort of a 3D view of that. Here's the viewership for the show, and here's the depth of conversation about that program online. So I think that will be helpful, again, to the broadcasters who are trying to understand and measure the volume of engagement around their shows. There are definitely some shows whose ratings may be lighter than another show in that time slot, but for whom the passion that the viewers have for it is so strong on Twitter that there's this story they can tell to their marketers that, like, our audience may be a little bit smaller, but it's incredibly engaged and passionate, and that should have value for you.
Do you help give them ideas of age demographics and things, too?
Yeah, sure.
Because I think I've read somewhere a famous show, Harry's Law on NBC, was canceled, even though it was a hit, because it had the wrong demographics. That advertisers want a certain, you know, demographic audience and coveted in this 20-something to 30-something age range. Michael, does that make a difference in terms of, you know, when you're out there creating shows, are you creating for certain demographics, or is that changing now that it's a global audience? Is it different in different markets?
If I'm going to be honest, we just want to hit. You know?
Just want to hit. Yeah.
We just want to show that a lot of people watch. Obviously, there's a demographic that's more desirable than not. It's a little bit difficult to judge up front what that demographic is going to be. And it's just as difficult to figure out whether a show is going to work or not before it goes on air. So I wouldn't say we do it for a specific demo, no.
Right. How do you guys look at innovation with new things? Like Barry Diller now has these new antennas, which has won in the court, surprisingly, where you can buy his antenna or you can rent his antenna, and you can effectively get whatever's broadcast for free on TV.
Right.
Is that something that's particularly interesting or threatening into the...
I mean, you'd want to be talking to a broadcaster right now in the United States to ask to see whether or not that's...
Julius, what's your thought on that?
I just can't take my eyes off of Dick's socks.
Okay, see, this is always the way. This is always the way it goes with these government types.
We do have sock envy. It's it comes with the turf. So look, the point one in our country for differentiation globally and a global competitive advantage, we need to lean into innovation wherever it comes from. So we need the best infrastructure for innovation, the best rules of the road for innovation, and it'll come from all sorts of places. Aereo is interesting, I think, not to me so much surprising that they won their legal case. We're not going to do the whole copyright remote DVR thing here now. Yeah. But because it exposes a tension in over-the-air broadcasters who simultaneously say, we really want and need retransmission consent fees so we get that revenue stream for understandable reasons so they can afford to produce the programming to compete with cable networks. And then they say at the same time that we are free TV available to everyone and therefore entitled to certain benefits from public policy. And I think one of the things that will come out of this process with Aereo is that dissonance will get resolved one way or the other. And it'll be very interesting to watch.
What would you like to see the outcome be?
I've made no secret of the fact that I think both video delivery and mobile are really important. Video delivery doesn't have to be over the air broadcast, 75-year-old system of 6 megahertz channels. Yeah. Mobile does. And so one of the big initiatives that we did at the FCC was a process of reallocating spectrum from over-the-air broadcasting to mobile broadband. I think for the good of our overall economy, to keep us moving on mobile and all the incredibly cool things that are happening, over the long term, that ought to be the direction. So that's my view.
Interesting. 38 million Americans on average watch television every week. On average, I think Americans are on the internet between 4 and 5 hours. If you're between 35 and 47 in America, you might be on the internet as much as 7 hours. That seems pretty far out of balance today. Do you suspect that'll influence policy in the FCC in the future? The
difference between?
The amount of time on the internet, amount of time on television in terms of how they allocate spectrum and what do they want to see happen?
I want to be clear about this. Exactly what happens on digital platforms, I think at some level government should be indifferent to, and it should make sure that we get wired and wireless infrastructure right so that content creators and innovators can produce the really cool stuff that consumers want to buy and consume. Yep. So from a policy perspective, I think the right focus is, do we have wired and wireless networks reaching everyone that are fast enough, that are high enough capacity, that are ideally a couple of steps ahead of where the innovators and content creators are going, not a couple of steps behind. And then, now, having said that, there are some policy issues that we have to wrestle with as a country that may be tangentially related to this. The future of news, particularly the future of local news, the effect that different new technologies are having on public policy debates. They're doing two things, in some cases driving polarization, but in some cases also providing a real global town hall that's improving the quality of debate. This is changing very fast, and I think we all need to be thoughtful about how we're going to use these new platforms as part of our great experiment in democracy.
But what are the policy questions related to local news? I mean, why is that I guess I don't understand why that's a policy issue.
Well, it's a good question. I think that preserving.
I know it's it needs work, but that doesn't mean it's a policy issue.
Well, no, it's a good question because we did work on this at the FCC, put out a really interesting report that looked at where the internet was having a positive or neutral effect on local news reporting and news gathering, and where it was having a negative effect. And I think there's no question that when it comes to local news, the number of local reporters, journalists covering city halls, covering state legislatures is going down. I think that's a democracy issue because I think if you don't have journalists checking city councilors and mayors and state governments, that's a problem for our system. The question you're asking is a really good one, which is in a country with a First Amendment, how are we going to fix that? And are we going to fix that because the government's going to say here's the solution, or are we going to fix it because smart entrepreneurs come up with business models to increase the number of local news reporters? I prefer it to be the latter one. My only point is it's something that we should pay attention to, and that the goal is one of more local accountability journalism in the United States that requires some work.
Yeah, I mean, the other night when that filibuster in the Texas state
State of Texas.
Yeah, in the state of Texas was going on, it really, it became like the #1 national trend
Along with her shoes.
on Twitter, and yet a variety of both local news in the state of Texas and frankly national news was completely ignoring it, while it was the entirety of the volume of conversation on Twitter. I mean, there was just this incredible spike in the volume of tweets per second about it, and it was riveting to watch on Twitter. And there was, there's certainly the local news folks in Texas obviously have folks in the state government buildings and so forth, and yet they weren't really covering it.
This is a fascinating area because right now, if we look on our mobile phones or laptops or our iPads, probably less than 5% of that content is local. But now we're on the precipice of sort of what's happening in the internet, and Twitter seems to be leading the way with self-service ad platform, which is now launched and live. Will local content become a more part of Twitter? Is that what we're going to see in the future?
Oh yeah, and there's no question about it. I mean, it's already a extremely large part of it. We just don't provide services that allow people to surface that, like tweet. I want to see a timeline of tweets near me, et cetera. But we're working on that, and it'll absolutely be a bigger part.
We had a fire nearby here last week, and I go on Twitter, and I hit a search, fire near Aspen, and there's the tweets about where it's from.
Yeah.
It's the only way I could find out. I mean, is this something you're seeing happening around the world?
Yeah, without question. But like I said, we need to provide better tools for users to be able to surface those, like map-based views of their time, map-based views of tweets, and again, just timelines of tweets near me. So we'll do that.
And how does the FCC think about the local internet? And was that part of your policy decision making?
Dick is right that social media, Twitter, other local social or content efforts are very much part of the solution. And I just want to be clear on what I was saying, which wasn't that we need to preserve local TV news or local newspapers. What we need is the outcome of providing to people in their local communities the information, the reporting, the news and stuff that they need. So absolutely, I'm with you, Jerry, that we're at the early stages of a revolution in local information and content that's going to be exciting from a business perspective, from providing people information of value, and from a policy perspective.
Yeah. And Michael, how does that change your business as you think about local internet becoming a big part of both from your TV perspective?
Again, when it comes to something particularly around scripted television shows and things like that, it doesn't, because we're a scale business. Mm-hmm. And for us, we need to have an enormous audience in order to justify the cost of those shows, mm-hmm. Even a show that's relatively inexpensive. So, yeah, to some extent, in as much as it affects local television stations and the syndication market for some of our television shows, it'll affect it. And certainly the marketing for those local stations will have an enormous effect. But as far as making content locally, there's no way that a company like ours could get involved with that, just because it's not.
You also run all Sony Music. Mm-hmm. Right now on the 200 million connected TVs, the first app that's #1 people watch is YouTube. #2 is Netflix, and #3 is a music app called Pandora. Mm-hmm. Pandora Radio is huge on this. Mm-hmm. So connected televisions now are also the place people want to listen to music in their living rooms.
And actually, the #1 thing they watch on YouTube is Vivo.
Right.
Which is music videos.
Right.
So finally, the music companies got smart after and this was Doug Morris who actually had the thought of it. They got smart after MTV and said, oh, let's not just give the video away to a cable network and allow them to make all the money. Let's actually hang on to it and make our own cable network. And they did it with Vivo, and I think at this point, it's pretty much the largest traffic driver on YouTube.
Wow. And you also have Crackle.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, Crackle, does it think about the local internet much, or?
Not really. I mean, what we do is we localize it as we move it. Crackle is a service that shows both film as well as television shows as well as originals on the internet, and it's ad supported.
Yeah.
It's a pretty big service here in the United States. When they move Crackle into a place like Brazil, which they've just done, and other markets around the world, then they localize it. But they're not localizing it to specifics around the U.S. market.
Right, right. You know, there's been a lot of talk in this conference, and when Dick was interviewed by Katie Couric yesterday, about the second screen, where people are actually out there watching television one screen. They have a smaller screen where they're interacting with Twitter. Do you see Twitter being always a second screen application, or do you actually see it also on the connected TV itself, where it's integrated directly into the TV show or into the application people are looking at?
Well, so I don't think of it as needing to be the sort of the 5 years ago vision of interactive TV, where the interaction is going to be sort of on the screen somehow. I think it will absolutely be you'll have your screen you're watching the show on, and your handheld phone or tablet that you're conversing on about what you're seeing. I think the tighter connection will come, and Michael and I have talked about this, and Michael can talk about it more eloquently than I can, that now the folks in the writer's room on some of these programs have the ability to react in almost real time to what people are saying about the program on Twitter, instead of, the day later or 2 days later, et cetera. And that will facilitate all sorts of creativity around things like live programming, of course, and reality shows, and not just voting, but other tighter integrations. And I think there are all sorts of fascinating creative ideas that the smarter folks in Southern California will come up with.
Yeah. I wouldn't say we're smarter, that's for sure not. But
well, certainly related to the program.
I think you're right. I think one of the interesting parts about technology as it relates to the way that the creative community responds to it is you never can tell. The folks build it, and then the people who are making the television shows or the movies respond to it in the way that they do, and that can't be predicted. In the case of Twitter in particular, what Dick just said is the case, which is unscripted or reality is most prone to it, which doesn't actually have a writer's room. But even scripted television now, there is actually, there is a real conversation going on between the audience and the people who are writing the show that is in big volume, and that never occurred before. I mean, yeah, there were satchels of letters, but it was never that way that they actually could understand what they were going to sing.
You have something called Sing Off, and you have something called Shark Tank.
Yep.
Is this an example of these things where the audience is?
Well, they're actually commenting on the show and voting on the show. I'm actually referring to writers who are writing plot and trying to figure out which character emphasize and things like that. And that's changed entirely. Time will tell whether it changes for the better or not, because ultimately, I don't know whether a mass audience is the audience you want to listen to when you're writing something, particularly if you have a thought in your head as to where the show should be going. I think some creators have a very strong vision for their show, and I think they tune the audience out rightly and say, I'm going to make this show, and people will come to it or not. And others, they mold it a little bit.
What about actually the selection of actors and actresses? I've heard that sometimes if they need to have a decision on when they cast someone who has more followers on Twitter might be someone that's going to get the nod or not. And that may be a one-off case that happened once
Say
before.
yes. Just
Yes,
say yes.
all the time, every time. I tell you what does happen, and that's true for film and television. There are actors and actresses who are very, very engaged with their Twitter audience. And while we may not cast a show or a film based on who those actors or actresses are, it has an enormous effect on the marketing of those shows and those films. And when the marketing department hears that, there's a bunch of different ones, so I don't want to list one in particular, but when you have somebody who's really engaged with their Twitter audience, it's of enormous benefit to the show in terms of gaining an audience. Huge.
Yeah.
Huge. But it has to be genuine on their part. They really have to do it. You can't sort of bring the actor in before the show and say, here's what it looks like. They have to have already been doing it for quite some time.
Yeah, that's right. You know, people have a really clear sense of inauthenticity now, right? On platforms like Twitter, they can tell if it's, you know, the person's been brought in right before the show comes
Here's
on
how
air.
you
and
do it,
Here's
you
how
know?
you do it. They have a great sense for that. And these actors and actresses and musicians that have a really authentic tone of voice and regularly engage, they just see their followers explode. It also provides people with a sort of a truly three-dimensional, 360-degree view of the person that's compelling for people, right? They sort of get the sense that this is a real person and they have these other things they do in their life, and that compels them even more to be a fan of the person.
You mentioned yesterday in your interview about some of the unusual conversations that are going on Twitter today. Can you tell us about some of those kind of conversations?
Well, yeah, it's this complete obliteration of these artificial barriers to communication between groups of people, and it's everything from, I mentioned one yesterday between this Canadian hip hop artist Drake, who tweeted the first million is the hardest, and then T. Boone Pickens responded the first billion's a hell of a lot harder, and but there are volumes of them. There are. Salman Rushdie he'll tweet these, he calls them literary smackdowns, and he'll say this author or this author, who's better? And, Margaret Atwood, another, amazing writer, will jump in and say, well, I loved this character in this book, was my favorite character of this person's. And so people who are just, fans of literature get to see these two literary heavyweights have this very public conversation that they would have never seen before. They're not, we're not all invited to the salon in London where Margaret Atwood and Salman Rushdie are discussing these things. So it's incredible, and it just happens sort of over and over again. And the chefs, you'll see somebody write something about recreating one of Mario Batali's restaurants and using recipes and using truffle oil, and Mario Batali responding like, I can't stand, never use truffle oil, I would never use that in my recipe. And so, you've got the person right there next to you, and it's incredible.
Yeah, and Michael, for you in television, I know in the film side of your business, you're very focused on social media and the conversation about the film. I mean, months before the film comes out, and oftentimes weeks after the film comes out, right? Is that also becoming the case with television shows, with hits? When you get a new hit?
Yeah. No, very much so. It becomes part of this, and it also, and I think Dick was suggesting or implying this when he was talking about the amount of the shows that go all at once. The traditional argument for not doing that, or the reason why I think that what Netflix is doing won't necessarily spread throughout the industry, is because there has always been a benefit, if you have a hit show, of all the conversation that would happen in newspapers or just conventional media in the weeks between or the days between a show aired. Now that's accentuated enormously by Twitter. So the notion that you would launch 13 shows all at once and permit a binge viewing of that show, it has merit, don't get me wrong, and there may be versions of it that are different where you go 2, 3, 2, 1, or whatever the case might be. But the fact that Twitter's in the middle of this conversation, you still, in my mind, want to see, in certain instances, in a lot of instances, big breathing room between each episodes of a show, so that you can build up the conversation, the anticipation, all that stuff.
Yeah, so binge viewing on Netflix is doesn't really help in terms of the sort of ability to have this sort of space in between you're talking about?
It's a different thing. I mean, you get different sorts of conversations. In the binge viewing thing, you get one guy or one woman who's just lost a week of their life, and they sort of they come out of the dark room and they say, "Wow, I just saw 5 years worth of The Wire. That's really great," and they tweet about it like crazy, and everybody goes and watches The Wire. Yes, it's good for The Wire in terms of having it downloaded, but it's a different thing from this episode to episode.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure.
Can you
it's
tell us more
having
about the
lost it.
tantric TV? Because I think that's
What's that?
Tantric TV. I mean, that's
It's not my phrase, by the way. Other people have used it.
Okay. And Julius, tell us, in terms of, as the lines between all these different platforms, sort of melt, and you see content on different devices, mobile versus, broadcast versus area. How do you guys think about that from a policy perspective?
Yeah, I think it's stay focused on the infrastructure. Again, high speed, high capacity, wired and wireless networks to everyone.
But that's not happening, though.
It is happening.
It is?
It is happening.
Rural areas?
Sorry?
The rural areas are getting the same?
Rural areas are getting the same. We right now, 93% of the U.S., partly because of a cable infrastructure that's very widely built out, has access to broadband. And in the last couple of years, we transformed a rural telephone service to a rural broadband service that in the next few years will get broadband everywhere. I'm worried about that. I'm more worried about whether we're moving fast enough as a country to go from thinking in megabit terms to gigabit terms when it comes to wired connectivity. That's the big issue there, and the things that Google is doing with Google Fiber to really push the needle on that, and the competitive response that we're starting to see now from the cable industry and the telcos is good. And on the wireless side, I think the biggest issue is that the demand from our devices on spectrum is dramatically exceeding the supply of spectrum. So just a little data point to give people a sense of this. So this device puts a demand on spectrum as compared to the feature phone that you had before it. It's not 10% more or 50% more or 100% more, but it's 25x. It's 25 times more.
Right.
And if you have a tablet on our mobile system, it's 150 times more. So we have a lot more work to do to free up spectrum for these devices, to think about new platforms for innovation like unlicensed, Wi-Fi. So I think those are central issues. Competition, as I mentioned, is central. Competition at every place between an innovator and a consumer. And as I said, the openness of the internet. I think we're in a good place now in terms of having rules of the road that work for both internet entrepreneurs and that are also driving investment in networks. But I think we'll constantly have to wrestle with issues. And
when you say we're in a good place now, do you feel like that's the sort of the path is clear for that, or do you worry about that?
I think
internet.
I think we have rules on the rules of the road on the books that are working.
Yeah.
That we put them in place 3 years ago, and if you measure them by have we seen an increase in private investment in innovation at both the edge and the networks, we're seeing it in the US and we're seeing it faster than any other country in the world. The biggest single threat to it right now is that one company is challenging those rules, and court cases are court cases. So I am worried. I think we'll win the case, but it's not 100%, and we're in a period of reasonable certainty and predictability around the rules of the road, and a court decision here could throw it all open. It would be an unfortunate time for that to happen. Europe and a lot of other countries are looking at the US and saying, hey, in the US, they're kind of figuring it out. They have rules that support innovative new internet companies. They're seeing investment in networks. They're freeing up spectrum for licensed and unlicensed use. So this is one where the risk is coming, I think, not from government, but from unnecessary litigation.
Yeah, it's obviously hugely important to us. I mean, when we think about the characteristics that make Twitter, it's public, conversational, but most of all real time. And to the extent we get turned upside down and pockets get shaken if you want to go fast, it's going to cost you this much extra. That's a problem.
So
for
net
us.
neutrality is still an important issue, you think, Dick?
Yep.
What do you think, Julius? Net neutrality. I mean, you've been for that. I heard the new FCC is not necessarily for that.
No, I don't think that's right. No. Net neutrality is what we were talking about here. The rules of the road around net neutrality. The rules are on the books. They'll stay on the books. It's this litigation that's the threat.
Right. And Michael, from you're neutral on it either, right? You don't, doesn't really bother you one way or the other. What happens?
Well, it bothers me a lot as far as piracy is concerned, and Julius and I have had a lot of conversation about that. You know, there's the rules of the road, as they say it. You want to make sure that it isn't stolen out the back door. But no, other than for that, we would like to see as many platforms out there as possible.
Right. Do you think connected TVs might help solve the piracy problem? Like in Brazil and Russia and places like this where they're big, and they're actually using apps to, they're paying for it in some form.
I think weirdly, yes, but it's not just about connected television. I think what's happened in a place like China, for example, where all of a sudden now people are watching the television shows and films more and more on devices, and there's a whole, that seems to be much more within the realm of what the government is willing to enforce as far as piracy is concerned than beating up on a bunch of people who are making optical discs. So yes, from a piracy standpoint, the governments in those countries seem to be more willing to engage on the digital side than they were just on the optical disc side.
Yeah. So I like each panelist to answer this. In 5 years, we have more television, more content, or same or less?
Well, I'll tell you the fascinating thing to me. I've been hearing about in the technology industry, I've been hearing about the death of television for going on 10 years now, and it's never been better. I mean, the quality and breadth of programming these days is just remarkable. And so I think that there's going to be, you will continue to hear that kind of discussion, but in my mind, there's more of it and it's better. So I don't see that trend stopping anytime soon.
Michael?
I think so a couple of things. First of all, and we were talking about this before the panel, I think the television and film and music too, but television and film in particular have always been enormously affected by technology. And film in particular, every sort of 7 or 8 years, a new technology has come along that has dramatically affected the economics of our business, whether it's pay television or DVDs or something like this. In the case of the internet and in the case of DVRs, but the internet as it relates to things like Netflix, for the first time, we have a platform that allows people to catch up on television that they hadn't done in the past. And I think what has resulted is an enormous improvement in the quality of television. Why? Because you can have these open-ended dramas, which you couldn't have in the past because you missed an episode of The Wire and that was it. You're out of the mix. Yeah. And so now all of a sudden you find these writers coming in who would like to create these 13-hour character arcs, much better than creating a 2-hour arc for television. And so you have this huge boom in dramatic television. That combined with these platforms that have all of a sudden come up, not just cable but internet, and the cable ones have increased. FX has announced they're going to do 25 series. So yes, on the whole, I think, and good writing, by the way, begets good directing. So great directors are now coming into television. If you look at the pilot season this year, there were a bunch of directors who you would have never seen in television before, including Ang Lee, who just won the Oscar. Right. And that gets you great actors. So in this sense, technology has improved the quality of television. There is a point, in my opinion, where people, and it's already happening, where people are saying enough. There is so much good television out there right now, and there is so much that's been announced that I know I watch a lot of shows. I probably watch 8 or 9 shows a week that I keep recording or watch on things. And you say, am I really going to devote 3, 4, 5 years of my life to another show about another dysfunctional guy doing another thing? So, at a certain point, it's like anything. The industry senses an opportunity, and we pile in, and we make all these great shows, and the consumer says, I'm not sure I can consume all of that. Now, what happens as a result, and I think you're seeing a variation on that, is, and that's what's so interesting, is what's returning, in my opinion, is the miniseries. So now all of a sudden, and you saw it with the Hatfields and the McCoys, and you saw more recent examples with other quality versions where you say to the consumer, you don't have to devote 5 years of your life. You don't even have to devote a year of your life. all you need to give us is 6 hours or 8 hours.
Right.
And so what I think is you're going to see now, and by the way, great writers and great directors will respond even better to a 6-hour or 8-hour story arc than they would over committing their life to 5 years of 13 hours. So now I think, yes, there will be more television, but it may be in a different version than the sort of 13-episode, 5-year commitment that we've all signed up for.
I think that's a fascinating insight that that you wouldn't have thought initially about.
You never think, yeah.
Right. That the ability to catch up has created the opportunity for these kinds of shows, right? Again, 5-10 years ago, if you had Game of Thrones and you missed an episode and you tuned in, where is everybody?
Yeah.
You know,
And nobody on Tweet would have been able to tell you.
right. Nobody on
Which
right.
leads to the binge
Right.
watching,
That's
right?
right.
Because you want to catch up.
Right.
Right.
No one would know. There would be no conversation you could go back and look at to see what happened. Right.
So the art form is, technology is great, and it's great that everybody's getting access to more shows and the fact that you can watch on all these devices. What's also interesting, and perhaps even more important, is that the art form itself is changing, and changing oddly for the better, which is not always the case.
Yeah.
Yeah. We've got about 5-6 minutes left. Does anyone want to have a question? We got a few questions. Oh,
Many.
We got a few. Okay, you're first.
My name is Christy Farrell, I'm CEO of a branded content company, and obviously this is one of the huge areas of revenue growth. What do you think the future of branded content is in news, in entertainment, and on your platform?
Go ahead.
Trusted content providers, editors, I think are going to get more important, not less. And so there's an opportunity for brands to strengthen as these incredible platforms like Twitter give everyone a chance to say whatever they want, whenever they want. So Twitter is an opportunity for news in all sorts of ways. It's a great competitive pressure on branded news outlets. But it's also an opportunity in the news area for branded news outlets to demonstrate to viewers, users, that this is information that you can rely on. People are, with greater fragmentation, with more stuff, just as a user, I think we all want some curation. On Twitter, you don't follow everyone on Twitter. And speaking for myself, I'm pretty rigorous about when I add someone, I take someone off, because that's the best Twitter experience for me. So I think there are huge opportunities for brands in this new world.
Michael?
As with all things, it's complicated. I think in the case of shows versus networks, I think the shows become more and more the brand, unfortunately for the networks, which have a tougher and tougher time associating themselves with those shows, because the shows then can be watched on lots of different platforms, and on certain occasions, I don't even know what network they're on, because I've been either watching them on a DVR or on Netflix. But I will say one other thing, and again, it relates to the creativity of it all, which is we in the film and television side constantly try and hang on to something that is a brand just to launch it. And either that's an actor or a name. We did it in the case, for example, of Pan Am. We did it in the case, and other instance of a specific actor, because we thought, oh, okay, we'll put a famous movie star or something in, and that'll work. In both those cases, it failed miserably. Why? Because the show wasn't any good, or the actor wasn't any good on television. So at the end of the day, the brand will only get you so far, and then if the show's not really good, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, I'd like to tell people, and it goes back to what Michael was saying about, an actor being told, type this before the show starts. The branded content and brands, just generally speaking, that are successful on Twitter understand that the conversation is the canvas. It's not take this thing and then try to jam it down people's throats, or I'll use Twitter to, generate buzz about this thing I want to jam in there. It's diving into the conversation and using the conversation as your canvas. Those are the kinds of branded content and brands that are the most successful on the platform.
Great. Gary?
A couple questions. Thank you. Firstly, do you have any perspective on the future of over-the-top video and the multi-channel delivery? In other words, Comcast or companies like or Intel, et cetera, licensing many channels that are today delivered via cable and satellite, delivering those over the internet. the effect you think that'll have, like, for example, causing Dish and DirecTV to plead poverty and therefore merge, and how all that will play out. And lastly, do you see any social utility out of any of this, reducing the vast wasteland? Thanks.
I'm not so good on the vast
see,
wasteland. I live in the vast wasteland.
I've lost track of all the questions, but let me say something about the vast wasteland thing first. So the vast wasteland is a reference to FCC Chairman Newt Minow's famous speech in 1962. He was JFK's FCC chairman, and his speech is remembered as talking about how broadcast TV was a vast wasteland. I went back and read the speech, and what it's really about in 1962 was how important it is for us as a society to think about how we can all harness new technologies to serve the public. And so it was in that context that he was talking about the opportunities of broadcasting to educate and inform the public. He talked about other technologies too, the new technology of satellite. He talked about he didn't call it cable, but it was cable. And so I think those challenges remain. Looking at all these incredible new technologies, as a society, we have an obligation to say, well, how can we best harness these to serve the public? And so right after this, there's a panel on education and technology. That's point one. Number two, I'll just do this and then I'll stop. Over the top really is where the net neutrality battle is most likely to happen. And for the last few years, the policy of our government has been keep that platform open for over-the-top video providers. And so that is the law of the land now, and in some ways that's what will be at stake in the litigation.
Okay, we have one more question. Gentleman right there.
Dick may have partially answered this earlier when he talked about his partnership with Twitter, with Nielsen, but in an age when there's so much data out there, and there's needs to be so much data about what our viewing habits are the Nielsen ratings still accurate? The idea of having a set in a certain number of homes, does that really still represent Americans' viewing habits? And then the second part of that question is, and maybe this is more directed to Michael, when you're developing content, are you looking more for a mass audience, a larger mass audience, or a more deeply connected, smaller audience that's more deeply engaged?
I'll speak to a bit of the first part of it. I don't have any particular competence or knowledge about the Nielsen rating vis-a-vis household share. I only know the Twitter TV rating that we're providing them with. And the thing I'll say about that is, while it is Nielsen's methodology that they will create to develop the Twitter TV rating based on the data we give them, the beauty of it is that since it comes from Twitter, and Twitter is entirely public, it's really fully auditable in a way that it won't feel like a black box, hopefully, to the industry. People will be able to look back to the very public Twitter stream and say, well, wait a minute, I can see here in the data that it looks this way, so I'm curious about this particular number. So I think that will be, the Twitter TV rating will be particularly beneficial as an artifact of Twitter being entirely public.
So I know we're short on time, but let me a couple of stories in terms of doing something for a specific audience and narrow versus broad and who we're trying to go after. So when the folks in the television group came to me with Breaking Bad, which is the story about a chemistry high school teacher making crystal meth, I said, this is the stupidest idea for a TV show I've ever heard. And they fought, and I said, it's your career. If you want to go ahead and do it. But part of the conversation is who will possibly, pharmaceutical companies aren't really, who are the second or third largest advertiser on television, they're not going to go after this. And sure enough, they didn't. And so the show actually had a really difficult time the first year or two. And it was actually because of Netflix and because of Twitter that show survived. So had we just paid attention to who the advertising community was, and now the show has turned into a big success for everybody. The second piece of it is narrow versus broad, and that's a really interesting question around dramas. So cable is where this renaissance is going on in television, and we see this quality television going. But the shows that are happening in cable are broadening in their appeal, and they're not necessarily shows that could only appear on cable. So if you watch Walking Dead, which gets 13 or 14 million people watching it, that's a show which theoretically could sit on a big broadcast network. So what does that mean now for broadcast? And so those shows we originally designed to be very narrowcast. Not Walking Dead, but Breaking Bad or Damages or Mad Men or any of those kind of shows. Now what's happening with the broadcasters are, they're in this dilemma, which is, what do we do to create a show that is for a broadcaster, which has to get a much larger audience theoretically than a cable show? But cable is now encroaching on what they're doing. So they're doing a lot of things. They're upping the ante in terms of the quality of the programming. They are going to miniseries. CBS has this huge success right now with Under the Dome, which is, you know, people who will remember it, it's just going back in history to when they were doing Roots. And not only that, but what they're doing, which is slightly different from what you're asking on the question, is they're not going dark in the summer. When we grew up, there was nothing on broadcast, and they'd wait till the fall, and all of a sudden they've said to themselves, gee, why do we have to wake up an audience again in September? That's really expensive. Let's try and fill the summer with things like miniseries so that we can keep a constant communication going with our audience, so when we launch new shows, we still have them, and which is one of the reasons. So that's the long way of saying the dilemma is now between broadcast and cable, and it's really the broadcasters who are trying to wrestle with what kinds of dramas should they be doing that get that big audience when they're dealing with these cable networks, USA and others, that are frankly making shows that are perfectly applicable to a broadcast environment. And it's made for some very, very interesting conversations.
We'll wrap it up with that. Thank you very much, everyone.